Señoras y señores, bienvenidos a este segundo día del Congreso del Seminario de las Tres Culturas sobre el diálogo intercultural y la libertad humana. La sesión que abre este segundo día es la sesión Reflexiones contemporáneas sobre el diálogo y la libertad. El primer interlocutor va a ser Niclas Rautenberg, de la Universidad de Essex, y va a ser en inglés. Por eso ahora cambio al inglés. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second day of this Congress organized by the Seminar of the Three Cultures on Intercultural Dialogue and Human Liberty. The first speaker, or the first section of today, is contemporary reflections on dialogue and liberty. And the first speaker is Niclas Rautenberg from the University of Essex. He is a PhD student currently, who is supervised by Jörn Schaub and Fabian Feiernhagen, and his main research area is the phenomenology of conflict, with a special emphasis on the experience of conflict. His interests lie within political philosophy, social philosophy, metaethics, and moral psychology. So a wide-ranging interest field within, all focused on conflict. He has studied in a number of universities such as the Free University of Berlin, the University of Hamburg, and also the University of Tours. We are very excited to welcome his talk today, which is called Ta-Nehisi, Codes Between the World and Me, a Phenomenology of the Racialized Conflict. With no further ado, Niclas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian, for this lovely introduction. And hello, everyone. Many thanks to the organizers, first of all, for inviting me. And I have to apologize right away because today there appear to be some construction works directly on the other side of this window. So you might hear a little bit every now and then, and I please excuse that. Yeah, I have a lot of ground to cover there, so I just will start right away. I have a little PowerPoint presentation here with me that might give some orientation, and I hope everyone can see that right now. And I will read off the script because English is not my first language, but without further ado, I will simply start. The conviction that all human beings are born free and equal remains the central pillar of liberal political philosophy to this day. Yet Enlightenment's aspiration to universal ideals is accompanied by racist undercurrents of a Eurocentric heritage that still run deep in Western society. The arguably most important liberal philosopher of the last century, John Rawls, envisions a well-ordered society in which racialized conflict would be overcome once and for all. This is achieved through a consensus on principles of justice that inform this ideal society's institutions and provide citizens with shared public reasons that they draw on to justify their claims. Sameness becomes the key to freedom, equality, and resolving conflict. Difference is not indicative of justice, but a hindrance to it, and Rawls's well-ordered society issues of race no longer, quote, specify relevant points of view, unquote. What does the consensus of an ideal society mean for us earthlings who are still far from freedom and equality for all? The killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and the many before them, the disproportionate effects the COVID-19 pandemic has had on BAME communities, and a series of other related instances captured by smartphones and broadcasted and streamed to our homes have made this painstakingly clear. Should we nonetheless stick to the rules of Rawlsian conflict resolution and invoke sameness and discount difference? This seems to be suggested by Rawls' scholars. Rawls himself is adamant that his utopia is realistic, that it is achievable in an imperfect world. And according to Jonathan Kwong, this gives us guidance, quote, to bring our own political behavior and institutions closer to those ideal conditions, unquote. The well-ordered society with its orientation towards sameness becomes our regulative ideal. I disagree with this view. The thesis underpinning this paper is that instead of relying on abstract sameness, we need to take difference seriously in order to devise sound solutions to conflict. More precisely, we need to bring into view the different experiences that people make when clashing with one another. This includes appreciating the experience of difference itself. Hence, we need a phenomenology of conflict and difference. Taking racialized conflict as my point of departure, I want to further investigate the phenomenological dimension of the experience of this conflict by drawing on the biographical book Between the World and Me by Black author Ta-Nehisi Coates. Reading Maurice Merleau-Ponty's notion of being toward the world and Alfred Schütz's concept of typification critically through the lens of Black phenomenology, I argue that there's a difference between white and Black being toward the world, and that this difference comes with racialized perceptual patterns structuring the experience of conflict. Though the undoubtedly provocative terminology of a white and Black being toward the world should be taken with a grain of salt, this paper yields at least two general aspects of conflict that inform my understanding of Coates' conflict experience. First, a conflict event is political when perceptual patterns render the other a representative of a rival or even enemy group. Second, racialized conflict constitutes an instantiation of a particular type of conflict that I call bodily conflict. This type of conflict applies whenever features of the body become markers for other features of the person that supposedly apply to them naturally qua membership to a political group. I end with some concluding remarks on the shortcomings of Rawls in conflict resolution and the potential for an alternative phenomenological conflict approach. Before I start, I would like to issue a trigger warning. In my presentation, I will quote rather graphic and at times brutal descriptions of racism, but I believe that omitting these descriptions wouldn't only drown out the voices of Black scholars, it would further distort the nature of racism. So the first part, the conflict event. Ta-Nehisi Coates' book Between the World and Me is written as an open letter to his son Samori, published the year after the St. Louis County grand jury had decided not to indict the killer of Michael Brown. In the book, Coates recalls an incident of his son's childhood that had occurred at a movie theater in New York City. Quote, "The theater was crowded, and when we came out, we rode a set of escalators down to the ground floor. As we came off, you were moving at the dawdling speed of a small child. A white woman pushed you and said, 'Come on.' Many things now happened at once. There was the reaction of any parent when a stranger lays a hand on the body of his or her child. And there was my own insecurity in my ability to protect your Black body. And more, there was my sense that this woman was pulling rank. I turned and spoke to this woman, and my words were hot with all of the moment and all of my history. A white man standing nearby spoke up in her defense. I experienced this as his attempt to rescue the damsel from the beast. Yet he was now supported by other white people in the assembling crowd. The man came closer. He grew louder. I pushed him away. He said, 'I could have you arrested.' I did not care. I told him this, and the desire to do much more was hot in my throat," unquote. As Coates' choice of the book title already foreshadows, the conflict event at the movie theater is paradigmatic of a problematic relationship between Coates and the world in general. It is a relationship that leaves him with a feeling of powerlessness and insecurity. And to further describe this relationship, I propose a critical reading of Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Being Toward the World from his Phenomenology of Perception, Part 2, Conflict and Being Toward the World. Being toward or being in the world is the pre-objective action-guided relation between a person and their environment. Existence is not about idle observation. A person is immersed in their milieu, invested in projects, and confronted with challenges for them to master. Existence, says Merleau-Ponty, is not a matter of I think that, but rather an I can. Like a bond between two persons forms the way they treat and talk with one another, a person's being toward the world structures the way they perceive of the situation and act towards it. Merleau-Ponty speaks of an, quote, inner diaphragm that determines what our reflexes and our perceptions will be able to aim at in the world, the zone of our possible operations and the scope of our life, unquote. At its most basic, tending to one's tasks is a corporeal endeavor. Perceiving a situation, acting in it are concerted bodily operations. Over time, persons develop motor perceptual habits. Learning to see a new meaning or to perform a new action in the world then is to acquire a new use of one's own body. What Merleau-Ponty calls the body schema is the register of these sedimentations. The body schema does not rest on a motor perceptual level. From birth on, being in the world is being with others. Challenges to a person are infused with social meaning, and this requires a modification of the body schema. This process of dilating our being in the world, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, begins with appropriating tools. Acquiring language is tantamount to possessing, quote, its articulatory and sonorous essence as one of the modulations or one of the possible uses of my body, unquote. In this way, the subject as lived body incorporates a whole social world, namely by extending, adjusting, and enriching its body schema. Further, this social world, as Merleau-Ponty writes, quote, falls back into being, unquote. That is, the world takes on social meaning. I immediately perceive challenges as culturally, politically, religiously, and or morally meaningful. Difference in these meanings corresponds to different forms of being in the world or toward the world, depending on the particular social situation a person finds themselves in. This point has long been put forward by Black phenomenology. In the words of Frantz Fanon, it is necessary to interrogate the sociogenic level. That is, the intersubjectively created meanings, institutions, and relations of power that shape experience and coordinate behavior. In the case of racialized conflict, this necessitates to understand the racialized character of the being toward the world of those involved in the conflict, for instance, the historical and social dimension of a Black person's lived body and the way in which oppression and domination influence their experience. So part 3, Black and white being toward the world. The Black body in its relationship to the world and the white body is a central theme in Coates's book. To him, modern US American racism revolves around and manifests in the Black body. Coates urges his son not to think of racism in abstract concepts, not of racial chasm, racial justice, or white supremacy, but in the visceral experience that is racism. Racism, quote, dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth, unquote. This corporeal experience of affliction goes hand in hand with a particular relationship with the world. The world is not a place to roam free, but to be war in. In Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty emphasizes the open-endedness of the relationship between body and world. He stresses the normal subject's ability to break out of habit, to create and play freely. But while white children may see a world open for their exploration, a Black child, according to Coates, is taught to be twice as good, to be cautious as the world is crushing. To speak with Frantz Fanon, the Black child, quote, encounters difficulties in the development of his bodily schema, unquote. That is, the child encounters obstacles to free exploration. Space becomes confined and narrows down on the Black body, exemplified in Coates' citation of Malcolm X's The Ballad or the Bullet speech, quote, if you are Black, you were born in jail, unquote. This constriction of the life world is not only one of the spatial horizon, but also of the temporal horizon that the Black body inhabits, because the ever-present possibility of it being broken shrinks the future to a horizon of imminent threats. According to Fanon, it is whiteness that disrupts the Black person's development of their body schema. Sociologist Elijah Anderson describes how spaces occupied by whiteness are structured by white norms, putting a Black person entering that space under general scrutiny and suspicion. Further, Coates reminds us that the influence of the white space is also felt in the Black space. For example, it is on performative display in the toughness of gang members, or as Black Lives Matter co-founder Patrice Can-Cullis describes, it is felt in the omnipresence of police force in their neighborhood, as well as in its impoverished infrastructure. In this way, the white space reaches over into the Black space. Hence, Coates, Can-Cullis, Fanon, and Anderson raise awareness that white and Black existence are not mutually independent from one another, but intricately interwoven through power structures. These structures' genealogy leads us back to the Black body. Through enslavement, the Middle Passage and slave labor, segregation, lynching and poverty, incarceration and police violence, sickness and chronic disease. The white person has not only shown and still shows to the Black person that their body is vulnerable, breakable, but also that it is inferior. Further, white being toward the world is built on and with the Black body. The wealth of the US's white population stems from the labor of Black slaves. Coates describes this unambiguously in the following quote. The spirit and soul are the body and brain which are destructible. The soul was the body that fed the tobacco, and the spirit the blood that watered the cotton. And these created the first fruits of the American garden. And the fruits were secured through the bashing of children with stove wood, through hot iron peeling skin away like husk from corn, unquote. In order to reap the fruits of their labor, white plantation owners denied black persons, quote, the right to secure and govern their own bodies, unquote. Saying with Fanon, they treated the black body as nothing but an object in the midst of other objects. The plantation owner treated the black person as fixed capital, as an asset they invested in for returns in sugar, tobacco, cotton, and gold. Hence, commanding, harming, even erasing the black body is not transgression, says Coates. It is, quote, correctly interpreting white heritage and legacy, unquote. When the white woman pushes Coates' son Samori at the movie theater, her action is for Coates not a mere act of impatience, but a reenactment of the decisively asymmetrical relationship between black and white existence. We also see this in the white man's behavior. His exclamation that he could have Coates arrested signals that he is aware of Coates' relationship with the police as a black man, as well as that he knows that he, as a white man, thereby holds control over Coates. Further, Coates' insecurity about his inability to protect his son stems from this relationship around the black person's vulnerability. It creates a looming fear, one could say with Matthew Radcliffe, an existential fear that reduces the scope of action for the black person. This fear changes its shape in parenthood. The existential fear of a permanent threat against one's own body is transformed and accompanied by the fear for the child's body. Coates remembers this fear in his father's eyes, who scolded and beat his son, quote, as if someone might steal me away, unquote. It is the same fear Coates feels for his son, whom he would not be able to save from the whims of the police. It is this particular being toward the world that shapes Coates' experience at the movie theater. It is his pre-reflective awareness that he and his son are exposed to the temper of other persons who will power over them simply by the fact of their skin color. In the terms of Merleau-Ponty, what is dominant for Coates in the situation at the theater is his body's I cannot instead of an I can. Part 4, types in conflict. Conflict perception is structured by social meanings falling back onto the world of the body. In the case of Coates' conflict event, the white woman does not push Samori for the individual he is, but because he represents something or somebody. The same holds for Coates' perception of the white woman, whose whiteness is key for him to understand the occurrence. In this section, I want to draw on Alfred Schütz's concept of typification to gain access to the socio-perceptual patterns in Coates' conflict event. Types are sedimented subjective experiences of a person's or a group's characteristics, body features, motives, actions, speech, and gestures. Types are, so to speak, abstractions and generalizations, one could also say stereotypes, and typification is the process by which these types fall back on the complex world and simplify experience. They consist of a nexus of features that are assumed to appear simultaneously. The phenomenon is meaningful and familiar to me insofar as its features correspond to a type. I then assume, or I perceive, the features that are not yet present in my experience without any conscious effort. The subjective experiences that become types through sedimentation can be made personally or they can be socially transmitted, for example, from one generation to another. Therefore, they take part in a shared stock, a social stock of knowledge. Corresponding to Merleau-Ponty's idea of motor-perceptual entanglement, types carry practical significance. Schütz argues that types structure face-to-face encounters, render social life predictable, and provide routine solutions to everyday problems and situations. This renders types also politically relevant. Am I debating with a socialist, a liberal, a conservative, an environmentalist, or a Nazi? My perception of the other as a token of a type will influence my attitudes, expectations, and actions towards them. Pace, Schütz, and Merleau-Ponty, who both in their respective ways assign priority to the concrete experience of the individual, I think that there are many social situations in which type trumps uniqueness. Lewis Gordon calls these moments epistemic closure. They occur whenever one presumes to have complete knowledge about the phenomenon at hand, thereby closing off any effort of further inquiry. I argue that Gordon's epistemic closure is a general feature of political conflict events, in the sense that a person's full individuality is secondary. People regard themselves as part of a community that shapes their sense of identity. As agonistic theorists such as Chantal Mouffe add, with this sense of belongingness is co-created the identity of outsiders. A conflict event with these outsiders turns political when they are perceived as representatives of a rival or even enemy group with whom one's group competes or struggles for power to order and shape the shared world. This competition for power can proceed along mutually agreeable guardrails, for example, in the form of fair elections, or derail into a fight for domination or even annihilation of the other. Once the other is identified as a representative, that is, once a feature of the other that forms part of a political type comes to my attention, this very type informs my comportment towards them. For instance, when it becomes clear that the other votes for the party diametrically opposed to mine, I know there's no way we will come to an agreement. When two marches clash, one fighting for and the other against the right to abortion, nobody cares about the names or hobbies of members of the opposing camp. It suffices to see that they are the enemy to resort to typical courses of action and reaction. Part 5, racialized typification and bodily conflicts. Coates warns his son of political typification when he teaches him that he, quote, must be responsible for the worst actions of other Black bodies. But why is Coates' conflict event political? Why do Coates, the white woman, and the white man appear as political representatives to one another? Prior to the confrontation, no debate has taken place, no opinions were voiced. I argue that racialized conflict is an instantiation of a particular kind of political conflict, that is, of bodily conflict, in which the body is politicized. This means that the body is the marker for a type of a collective that is perceived as a rival or even enemy group. In Gordon's terms, investigation in bodily conflicts tends to reach epistemic closure fairly fast. The body provides enough information for appropriate conflict behavior. As I've argued above, Black being toward the world and white being toward the world are interwoven through the treatment of the Black body. To be justified to treat the Black body as an object, to subjugate it, the white person developed a new idea and planted it in the hearts of their successors. This new idea, as Coates writes, is, quote, the belief in the preeminence of hue and hair, the notion that these factors can correctly organize a society and that they signify deeper attributes which are indelible, unquote. Or to quote Fanon, it is the racist who creates his inferior. Fanon observes how the children's magazines of his time depict the Black person as, quote, the wolf, the devil, the evil spirit, the Batman, the savage, unquote. Elijah Anderson teaches us that this forced embodiment of deviousness is still at play today, where white people learn to see a Black body as representative of, quote, putative danger, crime, and poverty, unquote. In this way, the Black body becomes a signal for eternal traits that pervade and transcend the individual person, applying to all of those that the Black body represents and that legitimize an ordering of Black and white existence. This racialized perceptual pattern is also at play in the conflict event at the movie theater. To say it with George Yancey, Coates appears to the white woman and the white man as, quote, criminality itself, unquote. Analogous to the types of about the Black body, there are types about the white body. For the whiteness of their skin stands in for a system that has subjugated, oppressed, and destroyed Black existence. Regardless of whether a person is a racist, their acts can present a system that puts Black people in general at a disadvantage. Hence, when Coates sees the white woman pushing his son, he does not see one body mechanically interacting with with another. Coates sees racism in action. However, there seems to be a difference in awareness about Black and white types. Coates writes that he, quote, experienced the white man stepping in as his attempt to rescue the damsel from the beast, unquote. The semantic proximity to the racialist types introduced by Fanon above is not a coincidence, but illustrates that Coates is well aware of the historically formed types in which he is perceived. Further, Black being toward the world involves encounters with obstacles to a higher degree than in the case of white being toward the world. George Yancey highlights that the incessant bombardment of the Black body with racialized types, the being treated like an object, provokes an inattention in the Black person, a split between how they see themselves and how they perceive to be seen, a split between experiencing subject and experienced object. This fragmentation is primordial. It occurs within the everyday life world prior to any theorization. Hence, an explicit knowledge of racialized types is preceded by an awareness in statu nascendi. A white person, on the other hand, may not be aware that their acts are racist or perceived as such. Coates describes this ignorance in the form of the dream that is the white American way of life, a success story of economic affluence, thriving families, and of a functioning and just democracy. Coates shows how this narrative covers and amidst the traces of systemic racism, so that the dream can keep on being dreamt. For instance, the narrative around the Civil War, quote, made enslavement into benevolence, white knights of body snatchers, and the mass slaughter of the war into a kind of sport in which one could conclude that both sides conducted their affairs with courage, honor, and elan, unquote. Oh. It is through distortions like these that racialized types become innocuous or even invisible. With George Yancey, one can say that a white child learns to dwell within, quote, the world of white racist practices in such a way that the practices, qua racist practices, have become invisible, unquote. This has consequences how a white person perceives themselves in a racialized conflict event. For if the white person does not register their racially motivated behavior and reasoning, core covered, as stemming from a particular and distorted perspective, they believe to speak with universal reason. White superiority comes with moral authority, as highlighted by Elijah Anderson. Putting a black person in their place is not an act of racism, but morally justified by the right way of life. Therefore, the white man's threat towards codes to call the police is a threat towards a black man in a white space to put him in his place. The white man does not only protect the woman, he protects the white space itself. And the police, as the guardians of the white space, are his allies he can call for reinforcements. Crucially, the white man does not perceive of himself as the avenger of whiteness. Instead, he represents the universal voice of reason and decency. To him, the conflict event presents an instance in which a black man behaves out of line. Conclusion. Bodily conflicts are conflicts in which the body is politicized. It is a marker for membership to a rival or even enemy group. There are other conflicts that are structurally similar to anti-Black racism. For instance, conflict events involving women, trans persons, or persons with disabilities can always turn political because gendered conflict and conflicts on disability revolve around the body. My paper is not meant to imply that bodily conflicts are only about the body. For instance, anti-Black racism is a systemic issue that involves voting rights, political representation, housing, health, education, employment. It involves debates and arguments about the facts of the world, about morality, politics, culture, and economics. Citizens may and do disagree on the validity claims to truth and rightness, and this gives individual conflict events the guise of isolated tractability. But bodily conflicts show that a conflict can begin prior to debate and disagreement. Rawls in conflict resolution, finally, is inapt for dealing with bodily conflict. First, the Rawls in citizen is oddly disembodied. Take, for instance, Rawls's famous thought experiment of the original position. To construct principles of justice, the original position abstracts away from the worldly contingencies of social abilities, status, and history and places them behind a veil of ignorance. Of course, the original position is a hypothetical device not claiming to capture the reality of political debate, but since Rawls's conflict approach relies on exactly those substantive principles that are justified via this thought experiment, the original position determines what can and cannot be said in public reason. Negligence of the body in the original position, therefore, also infects Rawls's conflict strategy in the idealized but nonetheless realistic, well-ordered society. Further, Rawls in conflict resolution tames conflict by requiring conflict participants to be reasonable. In becoming reasonable, a conflict can be resolved on the level of propositional discourse. Once a conflict enters public reason, citizens can make validity claims, debate with one another, and settle their dissent. Unreasonable citizens are to be contained. But taming conflict in this way masks that prior to the propositional level of conflict, the experience of conflict is structured by perception, and perception is structured by one's being toward the world and the types that form part of its perceptual patterns. Here, breaches and shifts between citizens may occur, and this fractures a presumed common understanding of a conflict's conditions. It requires serious reflection to reveal the types that are at work in one's own experience. And as in the case of the dream, their workings may even be covered by their being toward the world. Not addressing this level and focusing on singular propositional claims distorts the reality of the conflict. The norms of Rawls in conflict resolution share similarities with the often heard demand to colorblindness. But this demand is phenomenologically dubious and attacked by recent research in the phenomenology of race. As philosophers such as Emily S. Lee and Linda Martin Alcoff underline, we need to see color in order to get to the heart of the problem. It is through acknowledgement of difference and observation what this difference elicits in me that I can become aware of the ways the cultural boundaries of my world render the other an enemy, an inferior, a danger to me. Thus, there is already a dialogue at play at the level of perception, a dialogue that needs to be continued at the level of the spoken word that readjusts my understanding of a conflict. Such an approach can be found in the later Merleau-Ponty. Instead of imposing a universal viewpoint, which is ultimately Eurocentric, he urges us to interact with the other to form a lateral universal, in which self and other and their worlds test one another. Such a lateral universal is a general system of reference in which the perspective of me the perspective of the other, and, quote, the mistaken views each has of the other can all find a place, unquote. One might argue that simply juxtaposing viewpoints in an all-inclusive system of reference will not help resolving conflict. That much is true, but only if we think that juxtaposition is meant for idle observation. As Merleau-Ponty's later work underlines, the communal inspection of difference elicits a process of self-transformation. This is captured in Iris Marion Young's conception of asymmetrical reciprocity. It is also at the center of Bernard Weidenfels's phenomenology of the alien. Truly productive action takes place in an interspace of what is mine and what is other. Through letting the world of the other speak, a fuller view of the shared world comes into being. Hence, the juxtaposition of viewpoints yields epistemic value. A conflict event, then, is an epistemically privileged social encounter because it invites us to suspend our own world and work communally at creating a new one. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Niclas, for this talk. Extremely interesting and one of the key issues of our time, without a doubt. I've received several questions, and I'll just jump right into it. Andres Ortigosa writes, in the fourth section, you dealt with types of conflict and talked about how they could be passed on from one generation to the next, and also about identity. I understand that you mean that there are two levels, a collective identity and an individual identity. The question, does the individual identity have more of a self-identity or an inherited identity? Which of these is more important? If it is the collective identity, how does one religion or the other affect the question of the black body?
Could you repeat the last sentence, the last question, the last part of the question, please?
Yes. So the second part of the question is that if it is collective identity, how does one religion over another affect the question of the black body?
So maybe responding to the first part of the question first, about identity, individual and collective identity. I think that individual identity has a certain place, self-identity has a certain place, and in our personal encounters with our partners, with our friends, with our colleagues, certainly individual identity is important. And I think that Schütz is not completely wrong to put an emphasis on the thou relation, on the we relation between ourselves and others, and the uniqueness that transpires in these encounters. But I think when it comes to political encounters, there is at least a certain tendency that collective identity is prior and is dominant. And I think this is the case because we already have to make sense of, in order to make sense of politics, we have to make sense of the way different collectivities, different groups clash over fights of power. We can, for example, bring forth Chantal Mouffe for that observation, but I think that Chantal Mouffe overemphasizes this point. Paul Ricoeur in the Political Paradox makes this point as well. So I think collective identity is always then important when it comes to the political question: how are we going to order the shared world? When it comes to the role of religion as a collective identity, this is and to the black body, I must say that I can't really tell right now what the exact relation is between the two. What I can say is that for my research, I also conduct interviews with political actors from various backgrounds, and I also talked to a political activist and a politician from Nigeria. And as we know, in Nigeria, conflicts often revolve around religion. So the only thing that I can say up to this point is that religion definitely has a political dimension and plays this representative role in political encounters.
We also have a reaction from Professor Padial from the University of Malaga, who says, "Thank you very much for the excellent phenomenology you have made out of one of the most tremendous problem of intercultural dialogue." And he makes this question: could you describe the characteristics of institutions or structures that free the other from the need for self-assertion, for example, in the face of negative prejudice?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. I think the problem of the current institutional arrangements that we have is that they overemphasize the conflictual nature of politics, or that they mask the difference that is at play in politics. So I think we have these two problems. For example, in demands of certain kinds of deliberative democracy, we have an overemphasis on sameness, and I think this actually spikes the antagonization that we can find in current politics, that we demand sameness in a certain way and can't really live with assertions from the different from people who display differences to us, who have different opinions, for example. I think in a certain way what we need is maybe not a formal institutionalization of what I tried to sketch out at my conclusion with Merleau-Ponty's demand towards a natural universal. It is a form of weak institutionalization, maybe, to speak from a more from the direction of Axel Honneth on a Hegelian side of realizing certain ideals and norms. And I think that this is an educational issue, first of all, that spans not only education of the youth, but ourselves, that we have to re-engage with the other, and that we have to, so to speak, we have to survive the encounter of difference. And I do not yet know how that would translate into firm institutions.
Thank you. I'm quite sure that the many Hegelians at this seminar are very happy with that answer. We have another question from Marta, and she writes, would be the change of white space projection started from either predicative or enunciative language?
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
Yes, I also write it in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Would be the change of white space protection started from either predicative or enunciative language?
I would have to ask back what predicative and enunciative means in that context, but let me read that question again. Would be the change of white space. If enunciative means something that goes beyond beyond the spoken word and beyond truth aptness, then I would certainly say the latter. I think I have to keep it as short as that. I don't have anything smart to say to this.
So we only have a brief moment, but a few questions more. Someone wrote to me here. Could stand your ground laws be an example of white space? And I interrupt the question here to say that for you who don't know what stand your ground laws are in America, if you feel threatened in public space, you are allowed to defend yourself with lethal force. And you may even kill someone without any legal repercussions. So the stand your ground laws are quite discussed in America at the moment. So the question, so I continue reading. I read the question again. Could stand your ground laws be an example of white space? Conflict is created by the mere fact that a black face enters a predominantly white space. The body, yes.
I think, well, stand your ground laws and other laws, the Second Amendment, right, are all laws brought about through a white political culture. Charles Mills, for example, makes the point that the social contract is a racialized contract, right? It's a racial contract because the racial contract, the contract could only be agreed upon by, sorry, now they're particularly loud, by the white population, by the white public through exclusion of the black public. So I think critical legal theory, for example, makes this point that we would have to, queer legal theory for that matter as well, we would have to get a completely different take and look at how we, and how in the US laws are devised, laws are discussed, laws are set into motion. So right from the start, I would say that when it comes to legislation and jurisdiction, that there is that these are predominantly white spaces, although thankfully these the times are changing. And maybe to make that clear as well, I think you know, obviously from a Fanonian point, we would have to say that these attempts of the white body to put the black body into a zone of nothingness are dire, but I would say that, you know, they failed. They've always failed from a phenomenological standpoint, and I think they now fail on a political level, because black persons have formed a political identity and are fighting back, and rightfully so. And when it comes to this particular law, I think the distinction is between how it is used against another white person and how it is used against a black person. And I could very much see, although I do not have any statistical data, so I can't, it's mere conjecture here, that maybe this will be an interesting research question to see how this law or this claim is executed in difference between a white person and a black person.
Thank you very much for that answer. We also have a more theoretical question, and it concerns your use of Merleau-Ponty. Are Merleau-Ponty's points not concerned with human ontology as such? Is it problematic to use Merleau-Ponty as he is a white thinker?
Thank you. That is a very important question that I was thinking about quite a lot. So what I'm trying to do in this paper, or let me start differently. It's not only, I think the question is so, could be so potentially destructive for me, because it's not only that I use Merleau-Ponty, but as you can see, I'm a white person. I'm a white man, and do write a paper on this matter, on this highly delicate matter, and one can rightfully say, what do you know about this? How do you dare to try to explain this phenomenon? And the only thing that I can say is that what I'm trying to do here is not so much to explain, but to learn, actually. So this paper has actually been a very good experience for me, because I was able to learn not only from Merleau-Ponty and Schütz, but they provide more the jumping off points for a more critical reading of Being Toward the World, and more critical reading of typification that I found in Black phenomenology, in Black existentialism, and such authors as George Yancey and Lewis Gordon, but also a sociologist like Elijah Anderson, who did this research, this paper on the white space and the black space. And I think what it boils down to then is what Lewis Gordon demands of philosophy more generally, is to not lock black scholars and intellectuals into their biographical moment so that they only are there to provide data for us, that white philosophers, white theorists are then, there to analyze. So the division of labor is between, the black persons deliver data and the white intellectual is then there to analyze it. And what I think, where Lewis Gordon is absolutely right, is to take the work of black scholars seriously and to provide insights into philosophy, for example. And what this paper does is basically trying to learn from the insights of Lewis Gordon, George Yancey, and so on and so forth, to learn about not only racialized conflict, but actually more generally about a phenomenology of conflict. Yeah, I think
Niclas, thank you so much for a very illuminating talk in these times where this is really a key question in themes such as ours in this Congress with intercultural dialogue and human freedom. Thank you very much. And now I will move to our next speaker, who is Alessandro Colleoni. And he is a PhD student at the Fondazione San Carlo and also at the EHESS of Paris. He has studied at Milan and his research is mainly interested in phenomenology and hermeneutics and Ricoeur and Nussbau, and specifically Aristotle's concept of phronesis or practical wisdom. He's a member of the Association of Alumni du Fonds Ricoeur, and he's also an editor of the review Circolo. And the title of his paper is Rethinking Human Rights Under the Sign of Dialogue Between Paul Ricoeur and Martha Nussbau. And without further ado, Alessandro, please, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much for this presentation, and I also take the occasion to thank the organizer of this really interesting conference and for the occasion to present my research. And what I'm going to talk about is the way in which we can think about the really complex theme of human rights with a focus on intercultural dialogue as a way to afford this enormous problem, and with reference to Paul Ricoeur and Martha Nussbau. So I begin with Paul Ricoeur because in the 90s, he discussed this theme with a clear consciousness of the difficulties that are implied in a defense of the struggle for human rights, and even more, in pretending it is possible to give them a theoretical foundation. Instead of proposing a scientific or metaphysical grounding for these rights, he suggested considering them as the result of a common construction of the universal through the dialogue between different cultures. According to him, in fact, the interest which leads to this practice of compromise is not theoretical, but ethical. It is the shared experience of vulnerability that pushes us to overcome the idea of tolerance, conceived just as bearing what we do not approve, for the sake of a pacific coexistence. In this way, it becomes possible, according to Ricoeur, to create a common space for action, which let us pay attention to the cry of the victims. A good example of this kind of dialogue that is inside the works of Martha Nussbau, and this is the reason why I refer also to this author, because she tried to define, through intercultural confrontation, a list of what she calls capabilities that are essential to the human existence. According to her, this list can be a basis not only for justifying the existence of a series of universal human rights, but also to define their content. Ricoeur has also listed a series of capacities, which characterizes human beings as capable. but he has not discussed the intercultural validity of this list or its possible importance for a theory of human rights. For this reason, I will propose something like a cross-reading of these two authors. And this will also show how they both present as just a fact the existence of reciprocal comprehension between the actors of intercultural dialogue. So, to find a possible justification for this alleged fact, after having presented the perspective of these two authors and their common denominators, I am going to take into consideration some theoretical tools which are offered by the phenomenology of the will that the same Ricoeur developed in the 50s. In this way, it will become possible to clarify how living experience of an embodied subject can grant a space for an intercultural dialogue. Moreover, this is also going to make us better understand how Ricoeur could continue to speak of a common humanity without falling into a hypostatized conception of human nature. So if I can add one word before beginning, I'm really happy to speak after Niclas because he showed how phenomenology is able to let us understand difference and how this is important from a political point of view. I am trying to show how it is also a possible way to speak about maybe sameness is a really too strong word, but at least similarity to, and this from a Ricoeurian point of view implies something like a dialectic between these two sides. So I begin with Ricoeur. His analysis of human rights can be found in an extensive way in Oneself as Another, his major work of 1990. Here the theme of human rights is discussed as one of the cases in which it is necessary the intervention of practical wisdom. That is a concept that he developed on the basis of Aristotle's idea of phronesis. This is a form of knowledge which intervenes when moral norm does not allow the subject to define the correct way to act in a specific situation due to an excess of universality. Now, according to Ricoeur, it is impossible from a theoretical point of view to bring to an end the endless debate between the universalist conception of human rights, which affirms that they are grounded on some universal moral principle, for example, and the so-called contextualist conception, which underlines that they are part of the particular history of Western democracies. So human rights have a history. Ricoeur considered it unreasonable to continue arguing for one conception or the other, and he proposes instead to rely on practical wisdom. This humble form of knowledge is not going to offer answers as general as the theoretical positions which are opposed in this discussion. Instead, it is going to look for ways to ground that what we defend as human rights, even if they are not deducted from a theoretical common ground, they still result from a real dialogue between the different cultures which composes humanity, in its undeniable and unsurmountable plurality. This form of dialogue is going to be grounded on the acceptance on the fact that, I quote, potential universals are contained in the so-called exotic cultures, end quote. Hence, every universal that will be found will remain a potential universal, and I quote, whose genuine moral tenor will be established only by the subsequent history of the dialogue between cultures, end quote. In fact, what we discover in other cultures is always capable of pushing us to modify our acquired and, up to that time, undisputable points of view. This is clearly a weakening of the traditional concept of universality, on the basis of some considerations which are specific to the hermeneutical tradition. At the same time, this practical solution, which is proposed by Ricoeur, does not imply a refusal of the notion of universality. In the same way that, discussing translation, he opposes to the defenders of a radical untranslatability, the fact of translation, the fact that we translate. He confronts us here with the fact that, I quote, it is as though universalism and contextualism overlap imperfectly on a small number of fundamental values, such as those we read in the Universal Declaration of the Rights of the Man and of the Citizen." End quote. The agreement between the different cultures which signed bills or declarations affirming the universality of human rights is not here presented as a result of the discovery of some shared theoretical truth, for example, about human nature. Instead, it consists of an imperfect agreement on some values, which is another concept that Ricoeur takes from the universalist tradition, but given it a very different meaning. He calls it a quasi-concept. So the quasi-concept of value is interpreted by Ricoeur as, I quote, "a compromise term at the point of intersection of the claim to universality and the admission of the historicity of certain derivative duties to which corresponds the right of others to make claims on us." In his works of the 50s, Ricoeur yet said that our concrete actions produce a historialization of values. He says that there are no moral constants alongside or above various judgments, feelings, and mores, but still, varying history is a mode of appearance of moral a priori. This conception was developed by Ricoeur in a critical dialogue with the thinking of the phenomenologist Max Scheler. Ricoeur takes from this author the method of analysis for affectivity as a place of emergence of values, which allows us not to fall into a psychological or relativist interpretation of emotions. But Ricoeur refuses the conception of values as essences to contemplate that is proposed by Scheler, because he conceives them as always referred to an action in which we are engaged, whether its cultural and historical context. We should not forget that, as I mentioned before, in Oneself as Another, Ricoeur refers on this topic to practical wisdom. That is a kind of knowledge which always acts in a specific situation and in an engaged way. Hence, the universality of values that is affirmed by Ricoeur is to be understood, as he said, as a claim. This means that we are always asked to verify the legitimacy of these values, of these claims, considering that the risk to take as universal some values that are just the ones of a dominant culture remains a constant concern. Ricoeur underlines that this model of rationality implies the concept of compromise, a term that he uses to define a kind of rationality which acts when, he says, many systems of justification are in conflict. We do not discover universal, according to Ricoeur. We negotiate them. But, and this is the originality of his point of view, the fact that we consider them as the result of a compromise, so of a construction, does not imply that we renounce to say that they are universals. It does not consider human rights as arbitrary tools that we use for our political struggles, but that do not have any truth in themselves, like, for example, Norberto Bobbio in the same years. If through negotiation we arrive to affirm a value, what we earn, it is a universal, even if always a presumed universal, which is always subject to possible revision. And the reason is that, according to this author, the fact that we could arrive to that compromise cannot derive only from what we could call strategical considerations. It is here implies the conception of politics and right of Ricoeur that he defined through his reading of Hannah Arendt, which provided him with a definition of power grounded on plurality and consultation. But this allowed him to give a name to what he always considered the specific of politics, namely a will to live together, which is often hidden by the domination relationships, but constitutes the very foundation of every society in the ethical aim of good life. And this can be found in the political paradox that Niclas yet mentioned. So what we could ask now is whether it is possible to reach any such practical universal. We should not forget that, according to Aristotle, practical wisdom is one of the intellectual virtues that grant the soul with the access to the truth. Moreover, in Oneself as Another, Ricoeur underlines that this form of knowledge is compared by Aristotle to sense perception. In this way, it seems possible to look for a source for practical truth in the embodied grounding of the subject into experience, which is always singular and relative, and at the same time can present a universal structure, as it is shown by the phenomenological tradition. It is important here to remember, however, that when we speak of the experience, we do it through a specific language, and so through specific categories. This is a very important thing for Ricoeur in general. This prevents us from directly accessing to the universal. It is the same Ricoeur who presents some arguments that he found in his own religious tradition to justify the defense of human rights. And about these arguments, he never asked the agreement of people of other religious confessions. Hence, about universal, we can only build analysis which always remain open to further correction, coming from people with other languages or other theoretical reference, other cultural reference. In this perspective, we have to ask ourselves which experience could play the grounding role for the values which are implied on the debate on human rights. It is possible to find a point of departure in the concept that we find in oneself as another of solicitude, that is presented as an intimate union between the effective flash of feelings, which allows us to take part to others' suffering, and the ethical aim that takes shape in this experience as a call for responsibility. If Ricoeur proposes here an explicit rehabilitation of what he calls the feelings of pity, compassion, and sympathy, this is not a way to revive the idea of moral sense, as it was conceived by the Scottish and Pierce's tradition, for example, of David Hume. We are here confronted with a phenomenological conception of feelings that Ricoeur conceives as affects incorporated into a course of motivation, so as a source of the values implying it. But if we consider what he called the historialization of values, which implies an admission of the limitation of our own perspective, we are going to encounter hard difficulties when we want to impose our moral judgments on someone else, in particular in the case in which the cultural distance is important between us. This implies, one more time, an exercise of practical wisdom in order to address the following question: to what extent do we have to tolerate? Ricoeur never completely denies all limitation to tolerance, because according to him, this attitude derives from, I quote, an implicit or explicit profession of indifference. He says something that looks quite paradoxical from the point of view of our standard liberal conception of tolerance. That is, I quote anew, if to tolerate means something more than just to bear, meaning instead something like to help, then the aid to people in danger is definitely a new progress of tolerance. According to Ricoeur, we have to overcome the idea of tolerance understood as just an acceptance of what we morally condemn in order to guarantee a pacific coexistence with people who do not share our conviction. He aims instead at the creation of a real common space in which, he says, our many traditions would recognize themselves as co-founders of a common will to live together. An expression, this last one, that I had underlined as a central one in Ricoeur's conception of politics. According to him, if we want to achieve the moral refoundation of democracy that our contemporary world demands, we must not stay deaf to the cry of the victims. On the contrary, we have to let solicitude lead us towards the definition of a real humanitarian right to interfere at an international level. So he says this in a really explicit way. He is clearly aware of the difficulties which are implied by this kind of right, so as to speak of a violence of aids. He says that what he calls the violent, even barbaric history of the country's humanitarian operations has taught us how difficult it is for them to separate this intervention, allegedly legitimate, from some geopolitical considerations about their national interest at a long or middle term. But as we said, Ricoeur considers the politics driven only by interest and domination as only a pathological form, which hides the true nature of politics. Actually, as he wrote in his famous article, The Political Paradox, I quote, "Before being the hypocrisy which hides the exploitation of man by man, politics is defined by the ideal of equality of everyone faced to the other." We are then confronted here to a task, searching for a truth behind the pathological phenomenon of the imperialism which is justified with humanitarian pretexts. Ricoeur suggests the way of heuristics of indignation, which consists in, he says, a moral vigilance on the immense front of the fragile, that is, the vulnerability to harm. He tries to speak a heuristic on the model of the heuristic of fear invoked by Hans Jonas in his imperative of responsibility, underlines once more the awareness that Ricoeur has of the danger that is always implied by indignation, which is capable to open our eyes on the pervasive fragility of human life and so to awaken our solicitude, but which cannot be considered at all as an immediately reliable source for our private and even more public choices. The moral judgment and eventually the action should only come after a time of dialogue and building of compromise, which demands a plurality of actors. It is only this practice that allows us to partially correct the limitation of our points of view, which are implied by our finitude relation to the world. And I could also add from the ideological distortion that always are present in our point of view. In this sense, it is possible to consider as exemplary the case of Sophocles' Antigone, a play in which two completely opposite visions of the world confront each other. This kind of situation is the specific field of application of practical wisdom. As it is underlined by Martha Nussbau, it is this kind of knowledge that is required faced to the vulnerability that characterizes human life. Much more than any abstract reflection, practical wisdom is capable of adapting itself to the limitations implied by contingent situation, as well as to unexpected change and value conflicts due to its nearly perceptive and emotive nature. I refer here to Nussbau, not only because she has developed a political philosophy in many ways similar to Ricoeur ones, but also because she tried to translate her ideas into concrete practices of intercultural dialogue. She proposes to think the defense of human rights as a response to the fact that certain forms of vulnerability directly depend on political and social situations which can be changed. In this sense, it is useful to take into consideration her fieldwork concerning women's condition in India, in which she tried to take into consideration the Indian cultural tradition and the self-narrations of the Indian women that she encountered, to find elements capable of describing their suffering. According to her, it is only through this kind of research that it is possible to show that the condition of women in India is not tragic just from the point of view of Western observers, but also from their own point of view. Her application of this method and her specific results can maybe put in question, but the preoccupation to build a space where it becomes possible to take into consideration at the same time the universal and the contingent aspects of a situation seems to me to fulfill many of the methodological constraints which were shown by Ricoeur to be necessary on these topics. These two philosophers consider impossible to grasp universals once for all, but they also think that this does not prevent us from using in our concrete political actions the always partial and revisable results of intercultural dialogue. In particular, Nussbaum tried to establish a list of essential capabilities which make a human life worthy to be lived, to grant in this way a reference point to the concrete political struggles for human rights. This author modified many times her list, which she presents explicitly as a result of years of intercultural discussions. and which always remain open to revision. I would say that this list constitutes something like an attempt to concretize the capacities defended by the values that Ricoeur presented as grounding the agreement between the different countries which signed bills and declarations of human rights. The human being is considered by Ricoeur as capable and vulnerable, so the fact of granting the necessary condition for the exercise of his capacities means at the same time to act on the factors which determines a part of his vulnerability. Moreover, from his point of view, this also implies to grant him a worthy life, because he thinks that the self is to be declared worthy of esteem by reason of its capacities. It is important to say that the phenomenology of capable man, which we find in Ricoeur's latest work, The Course of Recognition, also presents an analysis of the capacities of capable men. He also puts here his own idea of capacity in dialogue with the economic theory of capabilities of Amartya Sen, who widely collaborated with Nussbau. But Ricoeur does not discuss here the intercultural validity of the capacities he presents, nor the value of this idea for a political defense of human rights. In this sense, I think that the works of Nussbau could be a viable way to fill this gap in Ricoeur's analysis. The idea of Nussbau to build a list of capacity finds its roots in her conviction that it is possible to find some form of universality in what she called the grounding experience, which are shared by all cultures and times. In the same way as in the passage of Ricoeur I quote before, this is presented by Nussbau just as a fact. She says, I quote, when one sits down at a table with people from other parts of the world and debate with them concerning hunger, just distribution, or in general quality of life, one finds, in spite of evident conceptual differences, that it is possible to proceed as if we were all talking about the same human problem. Nussbau is well aware of the differences which exist between the linguistic conceptualization that different cultures offer of a same experience. But she also thinks that this does not prevent us from claiming the existence of a more fundamental level of mutual understanding between cultures. So for the final part, I will refer another one time to phenomenology, because it let us envisage the existence of a pre-linguistic level which could justify the agreement based on grounding experiences that is mentioned by Nussbau as a fact. And I also showed to be implicit in Ricoeur's conception of human rights. The phenomenological analysis that Ricoeur devoted to human action in the 50s can constitute a reference point in this sense. He presents a conception of the subject as always engaged in the world through his body, that is an effective medium of all values. This does not imply a reduction of axiology to this vital level, because, he says, the reflections of the sociologists carry an indisputable power against all theories which attempt to derive the will from organic concerns. Still, this means that the social, and so the arbitrary, is not the only dimension that is here at play. History and body are, he says, the two roots of involuntary. Even if the concepts which we use to understand body are always determined by our history, the experience that we have of them is still co-originary to this history. And this makes it a potential source of intercultural understanding. This has a great value for the present analysis because an embodied subject is necessarily a vulnerable subject, which experiences the needs of the body and the exposition to wounds. However, Ricoeur underlines that the idea to build a moral that would be completely grounded on this vital level is an illusion, because life, he says, strives for effusion and destruction with an astonishing lack of discrimination. Moral construction, then, remains a rational process, which takes the form of compromise and practical wisdom. Still, to grant the possibility of compromise, we need the discussion to be taken on the same field, and phenomenological experience, which is at the base of our conceptualization, can grant precisely this level of foundation. We could be tempted to say that at this level we experience our common condition, maybe our common humanity. In that way, however, we seem to fall again into the idea that there is a unique human nature that we tend to reify, especially connecting it to our common biological condition because of the references we made to the experience of embodiment. Moreover, according to the phenomenological tradition, any naturalization of values destroys their proper status because it reduces them to facts, while they are at the level of meaning. So this is the problem of psychologism and in general of reductionism. Nevertheless, Ricoeur does not give up on the concept of humanity. Once again, he takes a concept of the universalistic tradition and he changes its meaning. In particular, in his radio dialogue with Cornelius Castoriadis, which is published under the title Dialogue on History and Social Imaginary, he says that, I quote, "Without translation, there would not be humanity," end quote. Hence, it is clear on the basis of Ricoeur's conception of translation that here humanity is not something that is presupposed, but, as he said, a regulative ideal in a Kantian sense, or a model of achieved communication. Castoriadis proposes an objection which is immediately assumed by Ricoeur as his own position. He says, "It is not possible to think humanity as a wholeness. What is true is that I want humanity as a wholeness. It is not a theoretical truth." So to conclude, we could compare this idea with a passage from one of the conferences on human rights to which Ricoeur took part, where he said that there is a fundamental act of faith about the overlapping of different cultures. He also spoke in another interview of an eschatological universalism. We understand now better why, if phenomenology can grant us with a theoretical justification of the existence of a level of intercultural comprehension, capable of granting the possibility of intercultural discussion on human rights, at the same time, it remains true that, according to Ricoeur, it is just through the practice of dialogue and compromise that we can give a content to these rights. Humanity will always remain something to come, because the communication will always be hindered by the limits of translation and the interests at stake. But at the same time, we need to think that it does exist one humanity, because this produces a positive hope leading the struggles in favor of defense of human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alessandro, for this very, very interesting talk and an important subject as well. We have several comments already, and Andres Ortigosa from the University of Seville writes, "Thank you for your presentation. As you mentioned, Ricoeur is thinking about religion and its relation to human rights. I find some doubt about this point. What human rights exactly are you thinking of? It seems that it would be difficult for him to think of, for example, Article 24, where it talks about having paid holidays. Can you tell us which human rights Ricoeur has in mind mainly?"
Yeah, so Ricoeur has actually worked, especially for UNESCO, in an attempt to define concretely human rights, and actually there he always had an attitude more of a listener than as someone who proposed his own point of view. So in order to really understand which are the human rights he has in mind, we have to look at some small interviews, or in general, we don't have a specific list. And this was actually one of my critics. I mean, we need to look somewhere for a concrete list to know what we're speaking about. I have just in mind one passage where he speaks about the problem of female sexuality and the necessity to think of a way to, understand the idea of a defense of female sexuality in the different cultural contexts. So, but this is just a random example it comes to mind, but I really think that we do not have an explicit answer of Ricoeur on this theme.
Thank you so much. So we found a weak, or Alessandro, you found a weak spot in Ricoeur. That's very good. perfect to write in the paper, right? Or to add. Anyway, next question is from Professor Padial from the University of Malaga. He says, thank you very much, Alessandro, for your interesting comparison between Ricoeur and Nussbau. Could you say more about the possibility of a narrative foundation for human rights? He also has another question, but let's start with this one first.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is, I think, a really important aspect, and I would link this definition of a possible narrative foundation to another definition that it comes to me from Olivier Abel, that is an important Ricoeur scholar, that is the idea of the metaphorical universal. So in both cases, the idea is that we cannot escape from our metaphors, our schemes, our narratives, but we need to let our narratives cross one with the other. So there is explicitly all this idea in some texts by Ricoeur on translation and on the ethos of Europe. This is a quite famous text. The idea that we have to put our narratives in contact. And also at this point, at this moment, there is an interesting concrete essay, the tentative to put this in a concrete way, because Richard Kearney is leading a project in which he goes in places where narratives are an actual problem, because let's take the example of Ireland or these kind of cases. So where different traditions, there is a tradition of conflict, and it's a concrete conflict that is grounded in our narratives or of our own, and it tries to bring people that comes from opposite frameworks, if you want, that face the consequences of conflicts, to tell their stories one to the other and try to see what happens when we do this. So we think that this is an ideal that Ricoeur proposed. He says the les états de paix, donc the idea of some state of peace in which it would be possible to share pacifically our histories, our narratives also of conflicts. So it is really his idea that dialogue and narrative are together, and this also answers to the problem of alterity. I mean, while I narrate myself, I try to show you who I am, and even if it is sure that you are going to impose your categories on me, it is possible to putting together narrative and dialogue to try to fix in some limited way this problem. I don't know if this in some way answer, but I think it is a really central point.
Thank you. So Professor Padial also asks, can truth be understood hermeneutically with its appeals to prudence, phronesis, and the temporality of the human living beings be a sufficiently firm ground to ground human rights?
This is also an enormous problem, because the problem is how we read phronesis, first of all, prudence, because it is clear that if we just refer, for example, to truth and method, so to Hans-Georg Gadamer, we have a reading that is only linked to the dimension of the particular. And this creates really enormous problem when we try to think this kind of problems. So my proposition was to refer in some sense to phenomenology, to put together these traditions, and this is Ricoeur's own way to discuss the problem. But there are other possibilities. Some scholars propose, for example, to put hermeneutics, Ricoeurian hermeneutics, together with pragmatism, and some others with the idea of, in general, of intercultural philosophy and of all the race, gender theories, intersectional theory, to build something that in any way can complete in some sense this hermeneutic. So the idea is that hermeneutics itself is a really difficult grounding for the possibility to think some things like human rights. So we try to put it together with some other traditions. It's an attempt, clearly. It is surely possible to think about a just hermeneutical grounding, because hermeneutics is not relativism. But I think that it's more fruitful to refer to mix different traditions on this topic, because it's a complex phenomenon, so we need more perspective.
Thank you. Yes, and as you also said when you interrupted yourself when you were doing the paper, Niclas Rautenberg's points came really clutch into what you were saying, actually, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, as I said very briefly, Ricoeur's idea is that we always have to look at all the sides of a problem. And he's really aware of the ideological distortion that are implicit in everything, actually, because he said that we always look to our social phenomena through the lenses of our symbolism. This is through Clifford Geertz's anthropology that he developed this idea, but this is clearly ideology. And we need, he says, a critical hermeneutics. So you see another crossing of traditions. Critical theory and hermeneutics, which are opposed in the debate between Gadamer and Habermas, for example, in Ricoeur's point of view, they can be put together in order to see the limits of, one can show the limits of the other. So this is the idea of a constant dialectic. And this, I think, also could be interesting for the Hegelians who are present in this conference.
I'm quite sure. I can see that Professor Pajal thanks you very much. He thinks it was very illustrative, and he looks forward to reading your text quite carefully. Unless there are any more questions, I don't see any more questions in chat, but I think this discussion was very, very interesting. We have a break now for approximately half an hour, and at 12 o'clock we begin again the morning session. And here we have the privilege of listening to Professor Anton Pacheco from the University of Malaga and Professor Jonas Holst from the University of San Jorge. And it's going to be very, very interesting. I look very much forward to it. And I want to thank both Niclas and Alessandro for these very, very illuminating talks that have really put a finger on some of the key issues of our time. So thank you very much, and see you in half an hour.